Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Maisie Harris. I'm an assistant curator in the Department of Photographs at the J. Paul Getty Museum. And I'm so pleased to welcome you this evening for a conversation with Ami Lay. I'm joining you from my home in Los Angeles, and that's on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples, with honor and respect for the deep history of this region. A few details about today's program. Live captioning has been enabled for today's session. To turn it off or back on, click on the CC button. It should be at the bottom of your screen. Please submit questions through the Q&A function. We'll be addressing those as we speak, as we're able, and also at the end, we'll have a Q&A session. So we look forward to hearing what you're thinking about. This program is being recorded and it will be available on the Getty's YouTube channel. It is such an honor today to speak with Ami Lay, an artist whose work I've long admired. It really gets to some of the central, really the foundational issues of American life. How does this country's past, the legacies of territorialization, of violence, of confrontation, how does that continue to play out? How does it continue to inform our present? How will it impact our future? Her work brings a really heightened awareness to these issues and to American sites, American places of intervention and of conflict. An My Ly was born in South Vietnam. She spent some of her childhood years in France. She returned to Vietnam before moving with her family to the US as a political refugee. She lived in nearby Huntington Beach for a while in high school and attended college on the West Coast before taking up photography. She's noted that her background, her biography spurred in her curiosity. I think that's such a great word, curiosity about situations, places, sensations, and we're certainly going to hear about that today. She's a professor of photography at Bard and winner of numerous awards, including a 2012 MacArthur Foundation Fellowship. And there's a fantastic new Aperture book on her work, published to accompany a retrospective that opens at the Amon Carter, actually in Fort Worth just this week. So we're so grateful, Ami, to you for joining us when you have such a busy schedule. Thank you for being here.
Maisie, thank you for having me. I remember you're visiting my studio. I think it was a couple of summers ago, and it was right after I gained access to the set of Saturday Night Live, and I was able to photograph the Trump White House Oval Office. I was so excited, and I was really happy to be able to share those pictures with you at the time.
It's wonderful to get to talk about the work that is a part of the series that you've been working on. And in fact, we're going to start with one of the images from that series. Can we have the next slide, please? This is a piece that I'm so blown away by. I want to begin with this because I'm grateful that we'll get to have it on view at the Getty this summer, actually as part of an exhibition. And I want to thank my colleagues at Pier 24 in San Francisco for lending that to us. It's part of this series that you've been talking about, the Silent General. Can you talk to us about the series? Oh, and I want to note for the people joining us today that this is a quite large work. This is printed around 5 feet tall, so their scale is really confrontational here.
So it's part of Silent General, which is an ongoing project that I started in 2015. You probably know my previous work, photographing the military, photographing Vietnam War reenactors, traveling with the Navy and the Marines all over the world. But after I finished that project, I felt that the war was coming home, and on the home front, I felt that our democracy was being threatened. All the issues that were arising were being taken in such rhetorical and simplified way, and I felt that I needed to explore those issues. And one of the first issue was the contestation of Confederate monuments. And they were important to me because they talk about the history, but then also they talk about the present. And so that ability to go back and forth and to make us reconsider where we've been was extremely important. So of course, the previous picture was Davies, who's on the left side here. I photographed that before it was being pulled down, so as it was being contested in 2015. So now we're in 2017, and he's in this Homeland Security storage. It's not that I didn't try to be present when he was taken down in New Orleans, but I was never able to be there at the right moment. And I think that impossibility of being there when things unfolded has been sort of something that I have ended up embracing as a way of working, and not being able to be in the forefront of battle, or not being able to be there when an important event unfolds. So instead, I tried to look at the edges. I tried to look at things in an oblique way. And here I got really lucky. I got to go into the storage. They are exceptionally large. I think you have to realize that the opening in the back there is actually the size of a regular door. So the statues are monumental. And I think they brought the statues there and then they built the shed around it. There's no, I must admit, this is not the most well done photograph that I've made. You know, it's very limited in terms of where you stood. But to be able to capture them like this, away from the kind of memorialization that had been going on with them, was interesting. But at the same time, I also felt that I was able to show this sense of Lee still overlooking something. And that was something that was important for New Orleanians, whether they were for or against the removal of the monuments. They felt the comfort of having Lee in the circle overlooking the entire city. So I wanted to be able to suggest both those things.
And you talk about this work, you describe them, the different parts of the series, you refer to them as fragments. Talk about that choice of word. I think you've already been hinting at why you think of them in that way, but maybe should we see the next slide? Maybe that helps. Thank you. Yeah, that can give us a sense of where this work came from for you.
Yeah, this is just a quick photograph to show that actually photographing monuments is not a new thing for me. I actually had been photographing sculptures and monuments previous to going to graduate school. But I think that they were just very academic and kind of rooted in this tradition of Western art making, while these new monuments are now brimming with history and tension.
And the pieces themselves are not only fragments, but I think you were inspired. The name Silent General is from a Walt Whitman, a kind of a fragment of writing. So that sense of maybe the spaces in between being important, kind of putting things in conversation. Was it the Whitman that inspired that language?
Yeah, absolutely. If we could see the next picture. I think that what I've realized at this point, after working on so many different projects, is that each one of my projects, whether photographs of Vietnam or the reenactors or the Marines training in 29 Palms, kind of all came together as a trilogy to talk about history, to talk about the war, to talk about memories and how we deal with the myth of the war and the myth of history. And perhaps there could be a project where everything collided and it didn't have to be 3 separate units. And that's what Silent General is about. It started out with being invited to the set of this big Hollywood film, A Free State of Jones. I became friendly with the director, who's great, Gary Ross. And he wanted me there to witness these trench wars and photograph them. And it was really amazing to do that. But I immediately realized that those pictures alone were not enough. And perhaps there was a way to weave in contemporary life issues that I was concerned about in terms of immigration or racial tensions and the racial wars eventually, social justice, all those things were swirling around. And I thought that maybe these photographs could kind of be the foundation of a larger discussion, and perhaps having a suite of pictures would help define a particular discussion. So each set of pictures would do that. So Walt Whitman wrote Specimen Days towards the end of his life, and it's a mixture, it's mostly prose, even though the language is very poetic and very lyrical. They were distinct sections that were called fragments that treated certain topics. And I first looked up his work because I needed to find a title for this work. And I was very struck by the fragment called Silent General, which is about Ulysses Grant, you know, this pretty almost average man who distinguished himself as a general, then as a president. So I love that notion. I mean, I think it's about work, and I love that notion. So I took that title and also got truly inspired by the way the fragments work. It's also his most autobiographical work. And so I started pulling 6, 7 pictures together. And what does it mean to have these pictures exist in a suite? Could we possibly have a discussion? What does it mean to have space between each pictures as well? And so Silent General has been constructed in this way.
It comes across so powerfully when you see the works together. And I think Whitman has, there's a quality of your work that's very like Whitman's, in this kind of juxtaposition between these American ideals or philosophies and the kind of on the ground realities. I think that the way those rub against each other is such a powerful kind of rhythmic aspect of his writing. And I think certainly what kind of creates the sort of unsettling experience sometimes of looking at your work. I think maybe we can see that in a little bit in the next picture, I think, which is also made in New Orleans. I know you've spoken about your sort of conflicted feelings about the kind of American road trip picture, but what was it like? I mean, you started this project after the 2016 election, or actually you had started it just before, in that, as you said, the ramp up of the rhetoric. What was it like being in the country? Can you talk about the difference between making the kind of landscape work versus this work that's very much about interactions with people that you were encountering?
Interactions, and it's also an incredible freedom. I can go anywhere. I can photograph anything. So it's very freeing, but it's also, it creates a lot of anxiety. So I think that what I ended up doing is thinking about what's important at the moment. And the question is, where do you go? Where do you find the photograph that may answer those questions, or that how does it relieve the anxiety? So this picture came during the summer of Charlottesville. That was very much on my mind. I think white supremacy, inclusion and equity and social justice, you know, all those ideas swirl in my mind. And I think instead of just trying to go and find something that would illustrate it, I think I just decided to go to New Orleans. I knew that there would be those monuments, and then just sort of wander around. And 4th of July is always such an incredible moment because everyone's out. And I came upon the scene. It wasn't exactly like this, but I felt that it was a gift, and the world is, I feel that the world is my oyster, and it's amazing how it keeps giving.
It is amazing. I mean, the expressions here. Of course, this photo reminds me of, you know, Luncheon in the Grass or something. This sort of these iconic images from the history of art. But I mean, I think you should speak a bit about how you make these pictures, because you're not doing a sort of point and shoot. I mean, you use a large format camera, so you're very present when you photograph. You're very noticeable.
Yeah, noticeable is the right word. So for the people who don't know what a view camera is, it's a 19th century style. I use sheet films. They're 5 by 7 inches. The camera's on a tripod. The lens is completely manual, meaning you have to open it and close it and cock the shutter. There's a bellow between where you slide the film in. It's upside down, and you view it on the ground glass. So there's a real disconnect between the moment you view the image and when you actually take the picture. And you only get 2 sheets, and then you have to get another holder. So it's a whole, you know, process, but it's wonderful in that It gives you an incredible description of the moment. You stand next to the camera when you photograph, so it's like a piece of furniture. You know, you don't have the camera in front of your face, which I think is wonderful. So you have to pose people in a way, you know. You can't just capture things as things happen. And Maisie mentioned this art historical references, and you know, Carrie James Marshall as well. You know, we all have these images in our head, but you don't think about that when you photograph. I was attracted to the young woman, the young woman's red hair, and love her dress, and she was like standing exactly like that. And then I started photographing her, and I turned around and said, oh my God, how could I not be looking? So I pulled the camera way back and asked the woman to get closer and stand the same way I'd seen her standing, and tried different variations. So I feel very lucky that I came across this moment.
It's fantastic. The sort of triangulation of their conversation, I think, comes out so powerfully. And I think in this image, there's such a specificity of expression, and it's feels quite different to me than what we see in the next image, which um, is sort of about, to me, you know, obviously interested in your thoughts, but to me, it's so much about this the labor that builds this country, that sustains this country, and is so often, you know, anonymous to us. Obviously, in California, this is something that we encounter. What, you know, what was it like being back in California? I mean, for you, making these types of images of labor.
I mean, I had driven through the Central Valley many times, you know, but never stopped, never photographed. And like you, I never really quite understood. But I decided to go there because I felt that was at the root of one of the problems for immigration, and why not to go look at um, uh, this very important foundation of the problem. It was eye-opening for me. And I never knew how asparagus were harvested. And I think I really savor every single asparagus I eat now. You know, you actually have to bend down, and you have a bit of a blade at the end of a stick, and you just lob off one asparagus, and then you have to bend and pick them up. And the labor is incredible. Um, so I think that's what the picture tried to suggest, is sort of these anonymous workers doing backbreaking, literally backbreaking work.
It's such a you know, American labor is such a huge topic, but I mean, I think you get at it so you know, so powerfully in this, with this sort of endless kind of horizon line. And again, I think that's a large format camera gives you that ability to catch that detail of the dirt and um, the expansiveness of what's ahead. I think, you know, this, you're so adept at capturing these American landscapes, again, these big topics that, like, how could you possibly, you know, depict it in one image? And yet I feel like in your landscapes, you have these kind of you know, these moments of frisson, these telling moments that get at it. And I think that that's true in the next image as well. I think you've included this diptych on the American border. Of course, border relations, as you're just describing immigration, you know, such a huge issue. It must have felt, again, daunting to go to the border. But I think you've gotten these like moments of just on the waterfront really feel very powerful to me. Did you have to make, you know, hundreds of shots to get these, or how were you able to find moments that felt?
I think it's something that I've seen, and of course, when you see these moments, you don't have your camera or something like that. And I come back, I think, every day to try to get the right light and the right moments. It's not quite as spectacular as I had seen it the first day, but you know, I learned so much from being there. I think I learned about the border being this physical thing, this natural physical thing, the Rio Grande, and this flow of life that is so organic back and forth is so antithetical to this idea of the wall. And it just seemed that, you know, it's not the answer. And so I tried to photograph how close people come together, the flow of life across the border, and the pictures of people, Americans and Mexican Americans working together. Um, so I think that was what this visit to the Texas border was about.
I think that's such a nice way of thinking about the flow of life and the flow of the river. And I think so much of your work, yeah, gets at that way that we live our lives and how often it does feel natural, and then sometimes it feels so sort of performative, as in the film sets. And I wondered how if there's a difference there for you, the sort of normal life versus kind of enacted life, and if that is something that you were thinking a lot about when you were making some of your earlier work. So this has all been sort of part of the Silent General project, but now I'm going to take us back in time a little bit for the next slide, to some earlier work that you made. That for me, this feels so much. I mean, I love this photo so much. Perhaps you could just talk about working with, I believe this is Colonel Greenwood. Could you talk about working with him and the experience of this earlier body of work?
So this is, did you want to talk about Colonel Greenwood first? I think it's the next slide.
Oh, I thought that they were both the same. I thought they were both the same person.
No, but oh, you're right. Okay, I understand the confusion. He invited me onto to visit their training on one of the ships, and that was my connection.
Okay, okay, great.
But this is Colonel Greenwood, and this is the Marine Corps training ground in 29 Palms outside of Los Angeles. And I made my way there in 2003 after we invaded Iraq. My intentions was to go to Iraq and become an embed, but it was way too late. And as I was researching and waiting to hopefully get to the top of the list, I came across pictures of the Marines training out there. And I thought it would be so interesting to just go there, you know, and this is the place where at the time, the Marines who were being trained had not gone to Iraq yet. So it's that place where, you know, you could still think it's like a fault line. You could still think, well, maybe the war will end, just like in Vietnam, where maybe the Americans will come back and save the country, save the South. So maybe the war will not start, and the soldiers, the Marines will be able to go home. But the landscape, the training, and this is right after I worked with the Vietnam War reenactors, it all kind of got mixed up, and you probably have seen from my work now between film sets and training and reenactors, being an outsider myself and then being an insider. I mean, which is the way I felt when I was standing on that international bridge above the Rio Grande. You know, I'm looking at this Mexican having their cars pointed towards the United States, and maybe at night one of them will swim across. Right now they're just entertaining themselves and trying to get some coolness from the river. But you know, I could feel myself being in their shoes and also feel myself now being an American. So that kind of shift back and forth is a personal experience, but I think it's also in the photographs, that kind of slippage.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a space that might be familiar to, you know, many of us around here. You sort of drive past these sort of barren landscapes, and occasionally we'll see a sort of, you know, something happening in the hills. And so it must have been really, you know, just fascinating and strange. Perhaps we can see in the next slide the way in which they're kind of holding these maneuvers as a kind of a training ground. I think when I look at these pictures, both this picture and the next picture, I'm so aware of, thank you. I'm so aware of your work with perspective, you know, not just the perspective you're talking about shifting from feeling like an outsider to a participant, but just your physical perspective. You know, when you're making these choices, you know, and you have this big equipment that you're sort of lugging around. I'd just love to hear you talk more about your kind of move in perspective? You know, when do you choose to try to get closer versus pull away?
Well, I've always been interested in scale, and I've always been interested in giving context to something, to an activity, to a path, to a house, and not just architectural context or kind of landscape context, but also a context within something much larger, like the weather and the sky, and that notion of something more ineffable and larger than us. I think that when you work with a view camera and everything is so balanced, and you think about compositions and the formal qualities, you know, it could become a little too formal or too beautiful, perhaps. And I'm always worried about, you know, my glorifying something. So I think being able to pull back and allowing for um, the ability to, you know, more ambiguity, allowing for the air and the weather to have some kind of echo and maybe a criticality to the whole activity is important in that. I think it keeps me grounded. I think it allows for more complexity in the reading of each image. You know, I think you could easily just focus on what the Marines are doing, but I think the graffitis are interesting, and I think the plants and the kind of housing it is. It's sort of like almost Robert Adams abandoned development, and the traces in the sky. You know, all of that matters to me.
Absolutely, and the light here, I mean, I think it's so right. It could so easily be beautiful, and that 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 work that you do to sort of balance that out. Every time I look at these pictures, there's something more to see. And that's something that we're hearing about from our audience as well. They actually are excited to see this work. And one person in particular, Catherine, wondered about if we could go back to the photo studio slide. I think that's just a few slides back. It's the color work. Maybe it's a good opportunity for you to talk about the difference between color and black and white. You know, when you went into 29 Palms, you'd been working in black and white. Talk about the thought process of shifting to color for this series that you made.
Yeah, I love black and white because I love the way things are drawn in black and white. You know, it's more like a black and white gravure, and space is described differently, and it's really about drawing. And I switched to color only out of what seemed like necessity at the time. I would be out at sea um, with the Navy, and we'd have overcast days, one day after the other. And it seemed that everything just blended, you know, the sky and the water, and then these ships that are gray. Um, and like, how do you describe, do you differentiate, you know, and in black and white, it would just be kind of like this mesh of grays. And I thought that perhaps with color, I could start distinguishing between, you know, a metallic gray that's bluer, and something else that's a warmer gray, or something that's a slightly different shade. And that's why I switched to color. But I have to say, I struggled for a couple of years before I understood how color worked personally.
I think it works so well in this image. It helps you so much get that sense of the kind of pomp and circumstance and the variations of blue come out. So I think it's, you know, it works so well in this series. Okay, and now, sorry to keep kind of shifting back, but moving a few more slides ahead. One of the question, actually, sorry, one back. Thank you. One of the questions is about maneuvering the camera in these high energy environments that you were in when you were with the soldiers.
I actually worked a lot alone on this project at the beginning. And then I was always holding the crew back, you know, especially when I became friendly with the people who were in charge of training, and I could bypass the public affairs office. They, you know, mostly we were out in the desert. So we'd see something, and then we'd have to pack up and get in the Humvee and move quickly. And I was never able to catch up with them. So I ended up asking some of my students to come with me, my students from Bard, because I'd be photographing during winter break or something like that. And perhaps there was a student who was visiting a family in California, and then they would come and help me, etc. So I started learning how to work with an assistant, which is a difficult thing because, I'm pretty private, and I think I felt very self-conscious having someone there and witnessing, that chaos that I go through, asking people to do things or whatever. But it's incredibly helpful to have an assistant. You know, no back-breaking night from walking up and down the stairs in a ship, or carrying all the gear and then changing film. It makes a really big difference to have someone.
Yeah, that's what I think every time I think about large format cameras.
Companionship too, because sometimes on the ships you start feeling, oh my God, I don't think I can have another conversation with a stranger. I just want to have dinner with someone and not say anything.
Well, I'm delighted to say that someone is asking a question that is right up my alley, which is, you sort of referenced some of the red tape of getting around the public affairs office, and I would love to just hear everything about all the red tape that you have to wade through to get to make these projects happen. But Sandra Matthews is asking about the process of talking to the military about working together, and maybe this is a good chance to move to the next slide, actually, and even to the slide before. Sorry, the next slide, one more, thank you. Do you want to talk about this earlier work? And this is kind of where it started, your process of beginning to work.
Yeah, asking for permission or asking people to allow you into their activity. I know people are always asking me, access. Well, I think that I have to do it. It's not really part of my work. I think maybe it's part of somebody else's work, that's or not, For me, the ultimate thing is to make the picture. And I think, especially when the access has been really hard, I get even more paranoid about how good the picture is going to be, because it would be easy to say, well, I've worked so hard to get on a nuclear submarine, so any picture I make on the nuclear submarine would be a great picture, which is not true. But I think that explaining what you do, in the simplest term, is what helped me at the beginning, to tell the military I was interested in the activities and how it's played on the landscape, that I'm a landscape photographer. And that helped me get into 29 Palms. And that experience allowed me to then have something to build on when I contacted the Navy and the Marines. I think it's always about asking, and you don't know until you ask, and if that doesn't work, you try to find a different way. And sometimes it doesn't really work in the end, and maybe it wasn't meant to be.
That's such a great point, though. I think we so often keep ourselves from doing things from just ask, they could say no. So it's great. I mean, it's a great lesson to just see what happens. Do you have to promise some kind of neutrality in your statement or the way that you use them, or?
No, I think that's what people ask, and people think I'm an embed, so somehow, but I'm not an embed. So I actually come as a visitor and leave. No, and I think that for security reasons, perhaps when I was in Guantanamo Bay, then someone looked through my viewfinder all the time, and it was more a question of not showing this building in relationship to another one for safety reasons and security reasons. But no, they've never asked. But I think I was terrified of what they would think of my work, and especially for Events Ashore, the color work with the Navy. It took me 9 years. So I think I went through 3 public affairs officers in New York, and on the third one, I think she probably thought I was a little crazy, that I would use my money and ask to go on all these trips, and my book was not coming out, and I think they threatened to shut me down. I actually finally invited them to a show I had at my gallery at Murray then in New York City, and I was really terrified. And they came in, and I think there was a picture of a machine gun on a wooden table, one of those Martha Stewart's wooden tables, with a beautiful sunset in the Gulf on an oil platform. And all she could say was, well, didn't someone remove these tables? Like, why would you want the wood table there? So I explained to her, this relationship between domesticity and the militarism, and how it was interesting, and how they kind of created this tension. And she was interested. Um, and I had a friend there. Am I telling too long of a story?
No, no, I
My,
that-
my,
I
my,
mean, it's
I
because
brought,
the
I
worlds are
brought
colliding, because normally you're in their world, and so it must be
Yeah.
interesting,
So
actually.
this was the first time that a military person actually came to see the work. And this is after 8 years of working on Events Ashore. And so I brought support. So my friend Susan Kismerek, who was the photography curator at MoMA, came. And not to do anything, but just to be there and be supportive. But she engaged one of the public affairs officers and invited him to have lunch at MoMA and come visit her in her office. And he did come in his dress whites, and it was really impressive. I think we walked into the restaurant MoMA and everyone turned around like, oh my God, what's going on? But that led to an invitation to spend the night in a nuclear submarine in the Arctic. So it was truly, a week later he called me and said, would you be interested in that? Yeah.
Well, I think this is wonderful. It's giving people a sense of the commitment that you have to these projects, the long term, and the way in which you really obviously immerse yourself in the work. And that's absolutely true in these earlier works, in which you were actually sometimes taking part in the kind of military exercises as well.
Yeah, this reenactment, I played the Viet Cong, I played a North Vietnamese army, a soldier out of necessity, and also to be, to have a kind of a freedom of movement, being with the Viet Cong, or being captured and then going on to the GI side, or such and such. And it's a very kind of controversial role to play, and it was kind of scary. But it was, the most efficient way to see all the perspective and be exposed to as much of the reenactment as possible. There were very strict rules during these reenactments, yeah.
About what you were allowed to say.
Yeah, or do, or what you eat, and to be in period and to be in character.
I think that's great. It really connects with the question that we've gotten from Ella, who's asking about what you've learned about photography, and do you feel like breaking rules helps or following rules helps? And you're describing a little of both, right? You're sort of following the rules of the military and the rules of making a good photo, but having to really make your own way to do that. Do you want to talk a little about like your schooling, and do you feel like that really helped set you up to make some of these projects, or do you feel like you really had to change from what you'd learned in school and about making work?
I think what I learned in school was about how to make a good picture, and form determines content. So the picture's got to be great, and I think a great picture for me, and I think there was a moment when I wanted to bring it up earlier, and we didn't get a chance, is that notion of describing something. It's all about the art of describing, and I think Whitman does that so well in his work, and he was a journalist. So how do you describe something in a new way, in an interesting way? So that hasn't changed. I think working with the military was restrictive in that I was only allowed to see certain things. I was only allowed to come once, perhaps, and I had to beg for a second time. But within those rules, I think I always had to remind myself that there would be surprises, that the world is full of surprises. And if you can't get that, just turn around. There's something else on the other side. And I think when I walk away from an experience, I always have to ask myself, like, did I get everything out of it? Did I ask everything? And I learned to ask. I learned to, make people wait, or be uncomfortable, make people uncomfortable, not be too high maintenance because they will never let you come back, but really try to take it to the edge almost. I always followed security and safety rules, but in terms of, um, stretching the time and it's hard because you can't plan. So it's all like by the seat of your pant when you get there and who you can become friends with and how do you ask something. Um, did we answer the question?
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful way of answering the question that you learned how to make a good picture and then you had to be willing to figure out how to do that when you're in very complicated conditions.
If something
Maybe,
doesn't work, what else is there? And I think the world is always so full of surprise. And I feel like I've been so lucky every time I go out, something happens, that is so unexpected. And you just have to be ready to receive it. And I'm not always ready. And I don't know, but I'm sure I've missed so many opportunities out there.
yeah, I mean that's a good sort of life lesson in addition to photography. I want to take this question from Sally Stein. Hi, Sally. Thanks for tuning in. It's so nice to have you. Sally's asking about using a little bit about what you were talking about the military coming to the gallery. Are you able to use the fact that you're an artist, making art to gain access to situations that might otherwise feel too political? Do you feel like that gives you a little bit of leeway, as opposed to presenting yourself I mean, you've never presented as a photojournalist, right? You've always presented as an artist.
Yeah, I think for sure, yes. And I think perhaps having started in black and white made it a little easier because somehow people connect black and white with art. And then I always talk about myself as a landscape photographer. And then I think for them to see that camera probably um, made somehow um, made it a lot easier and more acceptable. Um, I think that not yeah. I think perhaps the notion of how you present yourself and um, the camera and black and white, and then I think having made 29 Palms kind of gave me a little bit more credibility, and then it was easier to ask permission to work on the next book, which was Events Ashore. And I think today now it's so much easier because people can Google me on online and they know I'm a serious photographer and sometimes it hurts. I don't know, but I think that when you come on when I don't do this anymore, but on the last few trips when I came on a ship, I think people knew that I was serious, and so it was a lot easier. Otherwise you'd have to convince them that yes, you need time and you need to see something twice and this and that. It was always a bargaining game, and I don't think I could do it now anymore.
Well, you may feel that you're gaining access. I mean, you found it easier more and more to gain access militarily, but you're still continuing to give yourself projects that are difficult and making things that are hard for yourself. This might be a good way to. I just love to talk about what you've been working on lately, in the next slide, which is really taking up a new challenge for yourself, still dealing with some of these issues of the military and of violence, but making work in a really radically different way. And I'm grateful to you for being willing to talk a little bit about this work, which I was so interested to see in your studio a few years ago.
So this was started a few years ago before COVID, but COVID, the quarantine really allowed me to work on this more obsessively. This is a still that came from a porn film, a pornographic film that I discovered years ago that involved men dressed as American GIs, and it's shot in the United States and probably somewhere in the South. And it's landscape. It happens all outside. There's a scene of a group of soldiers, probably Marines, walking through the woods, and there's like a fake village. and it was disturbing, very disturbing, but it was also very interesting. And I just kind of shelved it, and then I pulled it out more recently and tried to draw it and tried to transform it. I wasn't sure what I would do, and came upon this idea of embroidering them because it's an art that's um, it's a great crafts that's very important in Vietnam. Um, and so I learned how to do it from I mean, I did do some embroidery when I was in school. My grandmother taught me, but I learned from these Vietnamese women on how to embroider these. I had to learn about color theory, about contrast, how do you transform something, and I don't know where it's going. You know, I've worked on different things and they didn't work out. This is the only one that's kind of working out. It took months to do it. It's actually not that big. It's the size of a laptop. I decided, you know, to choose that. I think I felt a bit more, it felt very strange to be working on that and trying to understand what it all means. Now it seems that it's even more compelling because of what's going on with all these um, anti-Asian hate and violence, and the killing of these women in Atlanta. You know, I think the idea of Asian women being sexualized, and it's something that came out of the Vietnam War, and from you know, being in the reenactments as well. Asian women are seen as either the enemy, you know, I'm the Viet Cong with AK-47, or I'm the victim, you know, running away in the village, or the vixen, and there's nothing in between. So, or the nerd now, I guess, in the United States, the science nerd. There's nothing in between. So, um, I don't know.
I mean, sorry to even say it this way, but it's just so powerfully weaving together these different threads of what you've been thinking about and working on, you know, to take these issues you'd already been grappling with, and just, it sounds like it's a more, I mean, much as using the large format camera as a kind of meditative, you know, you have to sort of get into sort of meditative space to be focused, you know, you're just focusing your energies in such a different way. Maybe that leads us to a question. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
I think that the notion of seeing this in real, you know, when you see it in real, you can't quite figure out what you're looking at. And I think as you get closer, then the details come up or you step away. And so that notion of slowing down and discovering something instead of the way people, I think, look at porn, you know, really quickly, and it's a kind of like ingurgitate, you know, porn. And here you really have to slow down, and this, you know, the details are not that explicit either, especially if you get close and then you start seeing the stitches. So that idea of coming closer or pulling away and reading the information in a different way, I think is interesting to me. And I also wanted to kind of, you know, talk about the fetishization of the uniform, you know, like making it, you know, super rich and super interesting, and like, what do you do with the skin, and what do you do with all of that stuff? So
It really brings the violence home, I think, too, the sort of puncturing. I mean, as you say, there's so many images that we sort of ingest so quickly every day. So I completely agree. The stopping, the pausing, the paying attention is such a crucial part of what art can give us, really, you know, the forced kind of stop. But the puncturing, I think, is particularly powerful when I look at these. And I think that connects us with a question we're getting from Eve. Hi, Eve, the curator from LACMA. Thanks for joining us. She's asking about the porousness between televised war and your work. And I think that really comes out in this, you know, porn related imagery. She's saying with reenactors of film sets, or the MASH-like images of 29 Palms. Can you talk about growing up? You know, was this the kind of visual culture that you were being exposed to in the United States? Maybe talk about your
I
early
was
work in
I
Vietnam.
was 15 when I at the end of the war. So I can't say that I experienced combat, but I was in Saigon in 1968 when the Viet Cong attacked the city, and we lived near one of the bridges where a lot of the fighting took place. So I experienced some of that. And, you know, I've gone to my school, and the gate is like in smoke because a rocket fell in there. You know, my great grandmother almost died. If she didn't spend the night with us, she would have been home, and the rocket fell on her house. So you know, I experienced war in that sense, not necessarily in combat. So my understanding of war itself, or of the military, also comes from films, from Hollywood films, from literature. So for me, it's just as mixed up as it is for an American. Um, you know, that idea of the myth and that idea of us being given information. Is it true information or not? You know, the war was going well. And I think living between this kind of liminal space is I think I've realized after working on discrete projects that it's all mixed in, and I think it's this kind of postmodern mix of all these elements that is the most interesting. And I was hoping that with Silent Journal to go back and forth between a film set, something that's unfolding in real life, um, monuments that were from the past but are now in the present. You know, weaving all of that in together would make for something that's rich and challenging and satisfying, hopefully.
And that thing that comes, let's see the next group of images, and we're just wrapping up here. And I think that's a great segue when you talk about the liminal space of experiencing war. When you talked about going into the pandemic and sort of, you know, you sort of said early on you had this heightened anxiety about the pandemic, and so you were stocking up. I think I was reading that you writing about this. You were stocking up as though you were going to war, but of course, in war, you don't have that chance for preparedness always. So I thought maybe that would be a nice way to think about what the work that you've been making over the past year. You know, it's as we've been talking about with the Asian American violence and so much violence in this country, obviously so much tragedy this year. Talk about how you've been navigating that. You spoke about walking through some of the solitary streets in New York, making work, these kind of quiet humanity moments as we see in the lower right, and also making work in DC. Maybe maybe a way into that. Sorry, I'm talking a lot right now, but I see that we have a question from Ty, who's saying how inspired he was when he saw the photography of David Douglas Duncan. And he's asking if there are photographers that you found inspiring in your photo journey. Have there been photographers you've been looking at over the past year as you're trying to think about how to navigate this strange time that we've been in?
Yeah, I certainly looked at a lot of war photographers to understand what they were doing, and I admire them so much. But you know, I spent my life looking at Ajay and Walker Evans, and you know that's how I was trained. And Stephen Shores, you know, or Robert Franks, the Americans. But I think that it's really about learning a language, having a foundation, and then going off and doing what you need to do for yourself. And I think that's the way it's always been for me. In that um, you know, you learn your language, and then you go and write your little essay and write your song, write your music. So um, I get inspired by young photographers' work today too. You know, I teach, so I look at a lot of work. Yeah.
Love that. I love thinking of your work as Ache. That's a nice way of imagining it. Do you want to talk about some of these pieces? Uh,
Yeah, actually, the bottom left picture is my little homage to Ajay. That's how I see it. You know, of course, I think we spoke about this. I tried so hard to get into the Trump White House, and I was able to do that thanks to a friend, David. and so the picture from the bottom comes from that. And I think I wanted to talk about this idea of theater, of the Trump White House being real theater. And that's what this moment was about. And of course, I could have just cropped next to the curtains, and that would be plenty. But I saw the crazy bush on the right, and of course, I thought about Jay. And I think the White House grounds made me think of park design and at Jay, and of course, there's a lot of anxiety walking into the White House grounds and thinking about what kind of picture you can make when it's been photographed so much. But I felt very lucky to do that. And once I felt comfortable, so this was in October. I think in May, I went to DC, and it was a little scary being out and staying in a hotel, but my assistant and I, we did it. And we photographed the Andrew Jackson statue, and we came across these boxes who were training in front. And this is right when the George Floyd demonstrations were happening. The next photograph is a young woman who was speaking for Planned Parenthood. And this was right before the inauguration, or the confirmation, one of the Supreme Court Justice Kavanaugh's confirmation. This was a protest. And of course, it's an oblique way. The Postal Service was so important, and this idea of voting by mail. I kind of stalked this postal worker for a couple of weeks, and was able to take this picture, which I really love, of her and the dog.
Well, it's a great way for all of us to be thinking about sort of the theater of politics. I think you've talked about the sort of politics of infrastructure and these platforms and stagings all around us. I think that's something we're all very mindful of now. So I think it's a nice place to end. I think looking at your work just reminds us all to just interact more engagingly with our everyday lives. So thank you so much for sharing it. And I hope that everyone who's joining us today is able to see some of this work in person. The retrospective on Millet, on contested terrain, which is organized by the Carnegie Museum, opens at the Amon Carter Museum this week. And it will be on view until August 8th. And then it will travel to the Milwaukee Art Museum. Her work will also be on view at the Marian Goodman Gallery in New York this summer. And we hope you'll join us at the Getty Center this summer to see Ammi's work in the exhibition In Focus Protest, which is going to be opening in the next few months. Thank you so much to Ammi for joining us. Huge pleasure to have you. Thank you to everyone who tuned in. My apologies for the questions that I wasn't able to get to today, but we're grateful to all of you for being with us. Please remember to visit getty.edu for more information on upcoming Getty programs and exhibitions. And thanks to the programs team for all their hard work to make this happen. Thank you all for joining us, and have a nice evening.